Good afternoon. I first wanted to express my very deep gratitude to SBS and my dear colleague Lee Chung-ae and all of her colleagues there who worked so hard to put this forum on. I hope you all realize what a rare thing this is for a media company to make such a commitment to such a vitally important subject. And I also want to say that being in Korea again at this time has been really overwhelming, and my very deepest sympathies to all the families and friends of the victims at Itaewon. It's been just a really a very, very difficult moment, I know, for everyone, and especially the families. But I also wanted to extend my gratitude to the journalists of SBS and elsewhere who have been covering this vitally important story. So thank you all for that as well. So if I asked you to name a country where democracy has grown stronger in recent years, could you? How about one where press freedoms have increased instead of diminished, where journalism has become more valued as a pillar of democracy and not dismissed as fake news? There are some. Tiny Liechtenstein, a principality of 38,000, this year entered the top 10 in the Reporters Without Borders ranking of press freedom across 180 countries. The Czech Republic, Bhutan, Ivory Coast, Lithuania are among countries that ushered in improvements to media law or access to government information, and all saw their standings elevated. But the undeniable trend is in the opposite direction, a world map that is bleeding red, where some of the largest and most powerful actors are increasing their assaults on democracy and a free press, and where even some historically democratic nations are retreating from free press protections. We are living through a democracy recession. In each of the last 16 years, more countries have experienced democratic declines than improvements in the annual Freedom House assessment, in good measure because of lower scores for freedom of the press, a dynamic that invites less government transparency and, as a result, more government corruption. Journalism, already weakened by industry economics, is running a gauntlet of abuse around the world. Free press predators, as Reporters Without Borders has named them, now sit at the top of a lengthening list of governments. This mirrors my own experience managing the Nieman Foundation Fellowship at Harvard University, which each year welcomes journalists from across the globe. Certain countries that once posed modest or manageable threats to journalism in my decade as director there now loom as very dark clouds. Independent reporting in places such as Hong Kong or Turkey did not carry the heavy threat of abuse or imprisonment that each holds today. But changes there and elsewhere have dramatically altered the landscape and emboldened autocrats who consolidate their power in part on the backs of silenced truth-tellers. Some of these democracy and free press adversaries are familiar foes, such as Russia, where Vladimir Putin recently made it a crime, punishable by up to 15 years in prison, to contradict the Kremlin, including by calling the war on Ukraine a war. This has essentially shuttered the independent press inside the country. Very concerning on this list of 37 press freedom predators is the belligerence in places once thought to be more benign. This includes Hungary, a country Prime Minister Viktor Orban has taken from a designation of free to partly free, in part by putting independent media titles in the hands of his political friends and allies, or Hong Kong, until recently the home to a robust independent and public media, but where Beijing's muscle has silenced many journalists imprisoned media workers, and caused the world's steepest drop in press freedom rankings from 80th last year to 148th. Or Saudi Arabia, where 4 years ago government assassins carried out the barbarous murder and dismemberment of journalist Jamal Khashoggi inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. US intelligence concluded that Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman approved the operation. His crime? Khashoggi, a contributor to the Washington Post, wrote critically of the Saudi regime. It's important to remind ourselves that journalism has long endured official animus. Thomas Jefferson, a principal author of the United States Declaration of Independence, wrote one of my country's most celebrated defenses of a free press, words that were literally carved into the marble walls of the newspaper building where I worked for 30 years in Chicago. He wrote, "Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter." 20 years later, as president of the young nation, Jefferson was not so sanguine. In a letter to a journalist, he proposed a new newspaper with 4 sections. He said they should be named Truths, Probabilities, Possibilities, and Lies. He added, "Nothing can now be believed which is seen in a newspaper." Jefferson's evolution is one that is common to people in power. Defending press freedom, I imagine, is much easier when you're writing a constitution than when you're running a government. But the current climate of endangerment and mistrust is inflamed by factors unimaginable more than 2 centuries ago to a President Jefferson, or even to the architects of South Korea's comparatively young democracy. An explosion of competing digital media has given us greater access than ever before to news and knowledge, but it's also enabled a worldwide pandemic for which we have no vaccine: the contagious spread of lies, of propaganda, and of hate speech, some of which directly targets the media, much of which the media have been ineffective in combating. Autocrats have exploited the new technologies to stoke these divisions, as we saw in Filipino President Rodrigo Duterte's unending attacks on my friend, the journalist Maria Ressa, winner of the Nobel Peace Prize and founder of the Philippines' leading independent news organization called Rappler. Along with unleashing the courts, government officials there, as elsewhere, have used digital platforms to spread ugly and even violent propaganda about Ressa and her journalists, who have endured regular threats, including rape and murder. Some in my own country have played a shameful role in delegitimizing the media, both at home and abroad, spreading anti-press rhetoric that gives succor to despotic regimes around the world. The term fake news is a deadly American export, popularized by former President Donald Trump in his war on journalism. Used in concert with enemies of the people, a phrase once employed by dictators including Hitler, Stalin, Mao, the language offers an eerie echo of some of the world's darkest chapters. Trump's efforts to overturn the US presidential election results relied heavily on the meme, "Stop the Steal," and the use of the internet to spread that lie and organize protests that resulted in the January 6th attack on the US Capitol, one of the ugliest days in American history. In the United States, once considered a model for press freedom and free speech, press freedom violations are increasing at a troubling rate, said Reporters Without Borders in this year's World Press Freedom Index. That index ranked the US 42nd out of 180 countries, a rather anemic standing for a nation whose origin story is rooted in press rights and which historically offered itself as a beacon. The organization attributed the ranking to factors including online abuse of journalists and the unprovoked harassment, intimidation, and assault reporters endure in the field every day. Michael Abramowitz, president of Freedom House, said, "Challenges to democracy in the United States have outsized effects beyond American borders. Other nations watch what is happening in the United States and take cues from its leaders' behavior. The ongoing deterioration of American democracy will accelerate the decline of democracy around the world." In Turkey, President Erdogan has used the same language as Trump to advocate a so-called disinformation bill that would represent an unprecedented attempt to suppress journalism in Turkey. In Poland, President Duda tweeted his praise of Trump in the battle against so-called fake news, all while his government had been systematically crushing the independent press in Poland. And in a meeting once with outgoing Brazilian President Bolsonaro, Trump gushed, "I'm very proud to hear the president use the term fake news." Back in the Philippines, Maria Ressa has dual citizenship with the United States. Once in a meeting with Trump, Duterte derided reporters as spies. The American president laughed. We also need to be honest about the bad actors within media who've exploited these divisions for audience and financial gain. Cable news television in the US, for instance, perfected by Fox News, offers programming better designed to ratify its viewers' political biases than report the facts. And a growth industry in so-called opinion journalism may rack up clicks, but it robs resources from more costly and time-intensive investigative reporting. We now know from a growing number of studies that the disappearance of this kind of journalism, especially at the local level, will increase everything from the incidence of business corruption to the cost of government borrowing. News organizations who traffic in the journalism of political affiliation rather than the journalism of verification do a tremendous disservice to their communities and fail the most basic test of their profession. I am not qualified to assess the health of your democracy or your free press protections, but there are many here who are, and I would urge you to give it constant, honest attention. As they say, the time to save your democracy is while you still have one. Are journalists here living up to their obligation to investigate and inform, to report for the public good, to serve as watchdogs against corruption? Are they actually innovating their coverage to account for the changes in where and how audiences get their news? Are they reporting on democracy directly, perhaps defining it as a beat and adding a new team, as the Washington Post recently did? Have they ceded ground to the internet trolls, or are they working just as hard as they are to drown out lies and propaganda with fact-checking? Beyond journalists, are government and social leaders advocating for democratic norms, including the vital importance of a free press to a healthy nation? When you debate amendments, as you have, to a law on media arbitration, are you doing so with the inflammatory fake news rhetoric that has divided my country and demeaned even legitimate journalism, or with a genuine eye towards stopping the spread of disinformation, whatever its source? The debate around press credibility issues has become so polarized, it's difficult to remember that it was not always so. Steep declines in trust for institutions have made it so difficult to find common ground, and there are fewer voices able or willing to mend the breach. But history reminds us that what this rhetoric can sound like. I found this clip of US President John F. Kennedy who sought not a government without newspapers or newspapers without government, but a democracy where what he called the abrasive quality of the press offered an American advantage over totalitarian states. In this clip I'm going to show you, President Kennedy talks with 3 television journalists at the 2-year mark of his short presidency. Listen to this.
You once said that you were reading more and enjoying it less. Are you still as avid a newspaper reader, magazine? I remember those of us who traveled with you on the campaign, a magazine wasn't safe around you.
Oh, it is. No. I think it's invaluable, even though it may cause you it's never pleasant to be reading things frequently that are not agreeable news, but I would say that it's an invaluable arm of the presidency as a check, really, on what's going on in administration. And more things come to my attention that cause me either concern or give me information. So I would think that Mr. Khrushchev, operating a totalitarian system which has many advantages as far as being able to move in secret and all the rest, there's a terrific disadvantage not having the abrasive quality of the press applied to you daily to an administration.
When you have,
even though we never like it, and even though we don't, even though we wish they didn't write it, and even though we disapprove, there isn't any doubt that we couldn't do the job at all in a free society without a very, very active press. Now, on the other hand, the press has the responsibility not to distort things for political purposes, not to just take some news in order to prove a political point. It seems to me their obligation is to be as tough as they can on administration, but do it in a way which is directed towards getting as close to the truth as they can get, and not merely because of some political motivation.
Even though you never like it. This lands on my ears like a foreign language now in my country. What's so striking here, in light of our current political discord, is the civility of Kennedy's comments and his recommitment to democratic fundamentals. He's clearly taking issue with some of the coverage of his administration, and he implies that reporting is sometimes distorted for political purpose, and he doesn't like that. But the criticism is paired with a fundamental appreciation of the historic role the press plays as a check on government. There isn't any doubt, Kennedy says, that we couldn't do the job at all in a free society without a very, very active press. I close with this photograph of my parents. This is John and Helen Lipinsky on the porch of their first home, not long after my father had returned from fighting the Korean War as a soldier for the United States Army. He left school to join his older brother on the battlefield, never went to college, but he was one of the wisest men I knew. I don't entirely know what the young soldier believed, what he believed he had come to fight for when he got off the ship that brought him to Busan. But I don't suspect that in his wildest dreams he imagined he would have a daughter who would one day travel to Seoul to talk about democracy. If I may, I would like to leave you with one of his favorite adages, repeated to his children throughout our lives, and which to me is something that is as good a goal for journalism in these complicated times as any I've heard. He would say to us, there are 3 sides to every story: yours, mine, and the truth. So I'd like to leave you with that thought, this idea of the truth, something worth fighting for, and something journalism is here to safeguard. 감사합니다.